Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Mitochondrial.
Today we have the mighty Dom D'Agostino, who is at the forefront of the science behind why low-carb diets work, and specifically the more extreme form of a low-carb diet you've probably heard a lot about lately, the ketogenic diet. It can be used therapeutically with the help of doctors to treat and reverse diseases like type 2 diabetes and epilepsy. It can also help the everyday person lose a lot of weight if done correctly. It's not a fad diet, although it currently could be considered a fad just because technically it is very popular right now and might get less popular in the future. It is, however, quite the opposite, as our ancestors have likely been eating in a similar way for millions of years, depending on the geography, time of year, and current world climate. I'd like to apologize for not checking the audio while I recorded. There was an effects knob on my old school mixer I used that got turned on and put some sort of concert hall echo effect on my voice. The Indiegogo campaign is going very well. Thanks for the support. Again, I'm not trying to make any money off this film, and I surely won't. Just break even and fund the rest of post-production. So watch the trailer and pre-order a copy to support us. Here's Dom. Okay, thank you so much, Dom D'Agostino, PhD. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So where did you come back from? We've had a couple times we tried to get on the podcast together and we were both traveling.
Yeah. Well, I have to think back now because I've been a lot of places. So I was in Miami for a conference, and from Miami, flew to Australia, where I was in Melbourne, and there was a talk with probably several hundred people where there was a huge interest in nutritional ketosis and nutrition in general, I would say. And then from there, I was at University of Alabama, then Institute for Human and Machine Cognition in Pensacola, and I do some work with them, and also at the Medical College of Wisconsin recently. So wow. We have really branched out to where people are collaborating with us, and we've sort of extended our research beyond the University of South Florida here in Tampa, Florida, to other locations, including abroad, where we are running a variety of different research programs on nutritional ketosis, on exogenous ketones for a number of different applications. So yeah, just meeting with people and kind of filling them in on the science and working with them to develop research protocols and to do research on a variety of things.
That's so cool. Yeah, I knew you're busy, but I didn't know you were just all over the place like that.
And teaching too. Yeah. I teach neuropharmacology here in the summer, so it was a bit of a tap dance to sort of teach and then get on a flight and then get back into teach again the next the next class, and then do quite a bit of research, or I would say academic obligations here at the USF with research and with committee and teaching and just running a lab. So we run a lab, and I have quite a few students. I'm just coming right before meeting with you. We had a 2-hour lab meeting where everybody sort of talks about what they're doing. And so we try to have them weekly, especially when I'm here. So yeah, always doing something and really advancing the science and the application of this stuff.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Thanks for taking the time to come on this. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I mean, you're in the weeds, you're in the cutting edge of this. You're not, just some blogger, So many of these nutritional people on the internet are just some bozos who have a computer, and that's not dumb. So,
well, that's important too, because, 10 years ago or more, there was not media available. Like people would have to go directly to the scientific literature. So what you are doing is extremely important, perhaps even more important than the science in some ways, because a lot of science has been done, but if it doesn't get to people, it's not actionable, it's not implementable. So making science accessible to the everyday people in a format that's entertaining and engaging is, I think, almost like the next frontier. It's really what we have to do. And I thank you for doing that. And I thank you for giving me this platform to talk about our research.
Well, of course. Yeah, I mean, I'm just following in the footsteps of all the smart researchers out there. But yeah, definitely just trying to use the film to get more people to realize all the benefits of this stuff. And you are actually one of the leaders, the sort of public faces of the ketogenic diet. I feel like I've heard you in a lot of podcasts. And
I came into this at a very like a decade after, for example, Jeff Volek was studying this, or even guys like Eric Westman, who's been using it for like obesity, type 2 diabetes, and of course way before the Johns Hopkins team and the team at Mayo Clinic were using it for epilepsy, which goes back almost a century, right? So I came in this very late, but I guess I have been a big megaphone, if you want to say, because maybe I did a couple podcasts that sort of brought more attention. And the nutritional ketosis kind of sells itself, because when you do it, you do get pretty rapid response in terms of metabolic biomarkers and things that can have real world consequences when it comes to managing disease states, but also longevity, prevention, and also a lifestyle. I would guess a big part of the community that has been interested in nutritional ketosis have adopted it as a lifestyle, if not all the time, using it intermittently for different periods, which they find, enhances their health.
Yeah, a lot of people have found it really transforming in their life. And why don't we take a step back a little bit? And you kind of talked about what you do on a daily basis, but why don't you talk a little bit more about what even ketosis is and the difference between nutritional ketosis and, fasting and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, sure. Glad to. So, taking a little bit of a step back, I became interested in this field of research because I was funded by a military channel, the Office of Navy Research, which is part of the Department of Defense, to develop neuroprotective strategies against extreme environment exposures. And one of the environments that we study here in the lab is the undersea environment, which you are subjected to a high pressure of breathing gases, and in particular oxygen. And high oxygen can create seizures. And through looking at the literature to determine what was already done, I wanted to develop something that was not only safe, but efficacious in delaying the onset to what's known as central nervous system oxygen toxicity, basically a seizure. And in the process of doing that, I discovered that what people have known for millennia is that fasting was a means to control seizures. Thousands of years ago, and over the last 100 years, the ketogenic diet, which mimics the metabolic state of fasting, was actually the standard of care about 90 to 100 years ago to control seizures in people who had severe epilepsy. So I became increasingly interested in using a nutritional approach, in part because anti-epileptic drugs do not work very well, even for people who have epilepsy, who respond well to drugs. Many times they become refractory, which means they work in the beginning, but then they don't really work well after. And also, the group of people I was working with was military personnel, in particular Navy SEAL operators, who do not want to be impaired by an anticonvulsant drug because they have quite a bit of side effects these drugs do at efficacious doses. So I explored the potential of nutritional ketosis for seizures, and we did that based on some of the fasting studies that were done in rodent models, and based on the use of the ketogenic diet for drug-resistant seizures. Then the ketogenic diet appeared to be effective against seizures independent of the etiology. The etiology is the cause. So it tends to work for all different types of seizures, regardless of the cause. There could be a genetic component. There could be temporal lobe epilepsy. There could, traumatic brain injury causing the seizures. And it tends to work across different seizure types. So that really interested me. The Military Institute the organization was not really keen on using a high-fat ketogenic diet, though. So we worked to develop a nutritional supplement, sort of food products, synthetic and also natural-based, that could rapidly get someone into a state of nutritional ketosis to give them that neuroprotection. And in the process of studying something very esoteric, which was CNS oxygen toxicity, which only occurs under extreme conditions, we discovered that And it was pretty obvious when we look at the cellular and molecular mechanisms of ketones in the brain in particular, that it's really enhancing the function of the brain cells, the neurons. And that had major implications for neurodegenerative diseases, because pretty much every neurodegenerative disease is pathophysiologically linked to energy dysregulation. And when you burn ketones for energy instead of glucose, essentially that's what's happening when you're fasting, right? So you have a very limited reserve of glucose in the form of glycogen. And after 2 or 3 days, you burn through that, and then you start using your fat for energy. But your brain doesn't effectively use fat as a fuel source. So it converts the fat to ketone bodies. And then the ketone bodies then become the preferred fuel for the brain in a fasting state. And the ketone bodies have a remarkable effects as far as their ability to generate ATP in cells. They are an energy source that the cell can use, but they play a role at reducing inflammation, and they even play a role on epigenetics, which means they can influence the expression of different genes that can be beneficial. So now my research spans across, many different pathologies, many different disease states, and even performance using various strategies to induce nutritional ketosis.
Yeah, there's so much to break down there. So maybe we just start with, maybe people don't even know what a ketogenic diet is, just a very top level. What does that mean? You said high fat.
Sure. Yeah. So a ketogenic diet is defined by a diet that elevates your blood ketone levels, right? And to do that, ketones are a byproduct of fat metabolism. So when we restrict carbohydrates and we replace carbohydrates in our diet with fat, and we basically keep the protein the same or slightly restrict the protein, then our bodies are incredibly metabolically flexible. So that's a trait that humans have, that they can survive off, they're omnivores, and they can survive off a wide variety of macronutrient sources. So your macronutrients are the things, on the bottom of the backside of a nutrition container. So that's your carbohydrates, your proteins, and your fats. So if you shift the macronutrient profile to be predominantly fat, in the range of 60 to 90% fat, and a moderate amount of protein to anywhere between 10 and 20%, and a very limited amount of carbohydrates, preferentially in the form of fiber or fibrous vegetables, then that is essentially a ketogenic diet. And when you eat that ketogenic diet and you measure the metabolites in your blood and the hormones in your blood, it will resemble, to some extent, the metabolic state of fasting, which means that insulin will be lower, your glucose will be lower, and it'll eliminate the glucose spikes after a meal and the insulin spikes after a meal. And it will elevate these things called ketone bodies that are beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. Not important that you remember their names, but they could maybe come in handy if you're researching the ketogenic diet. But importantly, those ketone bodies largely replace glucose as an energy source for your brain. And that is their evolutionary function. So humans are kind of unique in that they can fairly rapidly go into a state of ketosis, and they can survive prolonged periods of fasting. They can survive periodic restrictions in food availability simply due to the fact that they can make these ketone bodies to supply energy to their large brains, which are sucking 20 to 25% of the energy of their bodies. Now, the diet is a strategy to perpetually keep someone in that state of nutritional ketosis, and it's therapeutic. So it can be used to manage many different disease states.
Mm-hmm. So kind of a recap is, from an evolutionary context, humans have been fasting purposefully or non-purposely for all of time. We didn't always have food, and this is a very natural state that our body can be in, is to use these ketones. We're not necessarily supposed to always be shoveling food in our mouths, and that's probably not what happened evolutionarily. So we're kind of trying to mimic that in the modern day, because you don't want chronically elevated insulin. That's the cause of so many diseases. So people people either can fast or eat a diet that is high in fat and low in carb and mimic that state, because obviously we have to eat sometime. So we might as well eat in this way that's more beneficial to our body. Our body can run on fat or sugar. Most people run on sugar, glucose, but if you go into a ketogenic diet or even not an extreme ketogenic diet, I don't recommend everyone has to do that. But, there's varying levels of it, but you can at least switch your body. You said metabolic flexibility, so it's better to run on fat.
Well, I think there's advantages for most people to run off fat. Right? I mean, survival advantage, obviously, but even in our everyday world, if we are sugar adapted, we're almost a slave to sugar, which means that when our blood glucose goes low, we're not as good as mobilizing fats for energy or even making ketone bodies. So if you're fat adapted, your fat metabolism can be adapted in a way where you're preferentially burning fat for fuel. And we can measure that with, a metabolic cart or different tools in the lab. And I think there's major practical advantages to that from an operational perspective and from a health and longevity perspective. And it's a metabolic state that's been largely silenced over the last 50 to 100 years, just because of the culture that we live in really talks about a necessity of eating, at least 3 carbohydrate-based meals per day with no fasting ever, fasting being a bad thing. So to say many people who are not really educated in nutrition, or they may say that ketosis is a very unnatural state and you should do everything possible to avoid it. I would say that prolonged ketosis may be, even though it saves lives clinically, but to never go into a state of ketosis, I think would be very unnatural. And if we periodically do that with things like time-restricted eating, also called intermittent fasting, or just simply restricting our carbohydrates a few days every couple months or so and getting your body into that fasting state. And it doesn't even have to be restriction of carbohydrates. You could just do caloric restriction every now and then, and that resets your insulin sensitivity. That has some of the benefits of the ketogenic diet. And this is often a debate among people about when it comes to weight loss and the diet. And the ketogenic group, I'm somewhere in the middle, will argue that, ketosis gives a metabolic advantage, that you are, burning fat more efficiently. And you are, and you can measure that and prove that. But when it comes to weight loss, it doesn't really have an advantage over a carbohydrate-based diet that has the same degree of calorie restriction. So many ketogenic diet people who advocate the ketogenic diet for weight loss may disagree with me, but I have not seen convincing evidence that a ketogenic diet is superior from an energy standpoint in weight loss and obesity. But what it does, from my perspective, is that it makes creating a calorie deficit much easier because your appetite's controlled, your brain is happy because it's getting ketones. And I think that's the case for most people. I think it makes calorie restriction feasible and easier to implement. And the new science, and this is science over the last 5 years. So in the world of science, this is extremely new information that most people probably don't even know about yet. There's the ketones act as epigenetic regulators and they suppress inflammatory pathways that work independently of just calorie restriction alone. So, but I'm a little cautious when I kind of talk about the benefits in that regard, because that's new science and most of it has been done in animal models. But that's the direction we're going into and studying it in humans.
That part is interesting. But going back, what I learned while researching for this film, before I started out thinking carbs are bad and that's the only way to go. And then I realized there's more to it and there's two sides and there isn't really any bad macronutrients. It's just how much you eat of them, right? And that you can go on either side. And so, yeah, I'm not saying that everyone in the world has to eat fat as their whole diet, just run on fat. But what you said makes a lot of sense to me and helped me get extra in shape. And a lot of people around me have lost weight doing this, is that if you're eating a higher fat diet and lower carbs, your level of satiety you're not hungry. And these foods are really satisfying. There's multiple things that you mentioned, like biochemistry wise. But really, when he simply put it, if you're eating bacon and eggs, you're not going to be hungry for 6 hours. And you're not relying on these carbs and sugar and having spikes, every couple hours and wanting to eat more. So it's very easy to intermittently fast or not eat for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
And that helps a lot of people. And bad things are refined carbs and sugar, stuff like that. So I'm not saying if you eat a high carb diet to eat those things, but you can say eat, a lot of vegetables and tubers and fruits, maybe some healthy carbs, like not grains and not sugar, and avoid fat, and you can still do okay.
Yeah. It does come down to our carbohydrate tolerance, right? And when I was younger, I would eat copious amounts of boxed cereal and candy, but I stayed fairly active and I look back, and during that time, when I got more into video games and stuff, I had, the Atari, and when video games were coming online, I did go through a phase where I definitely got pudgy, and I was eating Pop-Tarts every morning for breakfast and bowls of cereal. And then, you get into high school and it's more about girls and athletics and things like that. And then I leaned out. But if I would have stayed in that video game kind of world, and I didn't live on a farm where I was baling hay and being outside all the time, I could see the trajectory of my health going downhill if I wasn't so much into sort of sports. It was a way of eating that if it was available to me, I would overeat it. And I think that is in large part a big problem with what we have in processed carbohydrates, because I go into various communities and we do sort of metabolic wellness or health screenings. And certain communities are just crippled. I mean, there's 12, 13, 14-year-old kids who are insulin-dependent diabetics now, and they're severely obese and overweight. And it's really due to an overconsumption of carbohydrates, because one could argue if these were not available to them, or the food culture was changed. And I think it has to do really with food culture. And there's also just the culture of the family and everything. But that would not exist. These problems would not exist. And that's going to be a massive health burden for the rest of that child's life. And it's going to severely cut down the longevity. They're going to die at a very, very premature age when you're talking about a 250-pound 12-year-old who's already on insulin because their pancreas is failing. And this is not a rare situation in certain populations or certain areas of the United States. Even it's pretty alarming. It's occurring at a fairly alarming rate.
Yeah. I think it's definitely an information problem, and then that would inform the culture problem, where no one's obviously trying to make themselves sick. It's not like they're only eating McDonald's every meal because people kind of know that, say, fast food is bad. It goes beyond that, where they're unconsciously doing it to themselves they don't know that drinking a gallon of orange juice or baby soda, I think people know soda's bad by now, but I mean, if you're just eating bowls and bowls of cereal and orange juice, some people think that that's okay.
Yeah.
Right. And then they don't realize that what's really happening. So yeah, it is about that information. And yes, the film is trying to change that.
And I think it's also important because you go into the same communities and there are groups of kids that basically have the same lifestyle. And, some are thin and some are severely obese to the point where it's going to probably cut their lifespan in half. And there's a clear genetic component here. There's there's people with a genetic predisposition. I know there's a group I'm working with in El Paso, Texas, where that particular community, genetically speaking, they're prone to type 2 diabetes, and they are very carbohydrate intolerant, I guess you would say, from a genetic standpoint. And that kind of been that they're a geographical location that has been intensely studied by people who are looking at metabolic syndrome and diabetes and things like that. So there's no doubt there's genetic factors at play. But I think this is something that could be useful to healthcare practitioners early on. And the pediatric doctors, maybe we can use things like nutrigenomics. Maybe we can use genetic data to basically determine if the nutritional whether or not they follow the nutritional guidelines, but maybe we can use genetics to determine. And you can also look at, the person's family and their mother and father and kind of, their first and second generation relatives to predict this. But that does become more of a factor. It's not something that I gave a whole lot of thought to when I got into this research, but the more I travel around and actually do health screenings where we're measuring blood glucose levels of people. I mean, there's kids that have glucose levels in 200-300 range, and that needs to be mitigated as soon as possible, and that needs to be checked by their pediatrician, and they are clearly genetically predisposed. And I don't think we're giving enough, because that person is going to not only cut their life short, and it's going to be a huge impact on their quality of life and the people around them, but also they're going to be a major factor in healthcare funding, healthcare costs. So these are just some of the things that I see the more I get out into communities. And I kind of, in academia, we sort of live in a bubble, but the more I get out and travel to these areas, even outside the United States, like in Puerto Rico, for example, or even places like Honduras and Haiti and places that traditionally did not have these problems, the availability of processed carbohydrates and especially lots of sugary drinks is starting to make it a problem.
Yeah, the westernized diet is ruining people all over the world.
Yeah. And you don't realize it until you really travel. My wife and I, we travel a lot. I mean, we were just all in the Philippines and in Thailand and Cambodia and Borneo and all these places. In the little nooks and crannies of the world, you see Coke and Pepsi banners all over the place. And, and sometimes when you're traveling, you even drink that because sometimes the water's not very good. But you just see it permeating the world population, not just the United States. And that's something that has happened to just over the last couple decades. This is a relatively, and the whole global time scale from a big picture, that's just a blip in the time scale. And we're seeing some pretty remarkable observations in some of these communities. So.
And then even the pockets who don't get touched by the westernized culture, they're perfectly healthy. And then it's almost immediate when they get these refined grains and sugars that they immediately, their health goes south. And it's like so clear. It's the one thing that I don't think anyone can debate how big a problem this is. And I think it's about how recently they've been introduced to all this stuff, right? I mean, talk about in Asia where people can get away with eating tons of rice and they have a high carbohydrate tolerance. And it's maybe because they've been eating those foods for so long. But when you introduce a population who isn't used to it, to this stuff, they quickly get damaged. The, say Inuit or American Indians, when they didn't have all this stuff, and then they quickly get type 2 diabetes and obesity.
Yeah. You bring up a good point, is that there are some cultures who thrive fairly well off a carbohydrate-based diet in Asia in particular. But, those cultures, the food is relatively bland. So if you're eating rice, for example, that we all know what rice tastes like, and you could eat a food that has the same glycemic index and even glycemic load, but if it's hyper palatable, it's going to be stimulating not necessarily our glucose and insulin response, but stimulating in our brain in a way that is going to want us to crave that food more. So it really becomes like a carbohydrate or sugar addiction that comes into play here. And some people may debate that, but there's definitely no doubt that things like Doritos, things like, they're
engineered flavors. And
it's engineered to be hyper palatable. And, brain scans have even determined if you eat a bowl of rice and then you eat some sugary candy that has a similar glycemic effect, it's going to have a different dopaminergic effect on the brain. It's going to, there's areas of the brain, and I just taught neuropharmacology, and we look at some of the brain scans and the nucleus accumbens, for example. It's part of a dopamine pathway linked to addiction, in particular to things like cocaine and other drugs too, but it lights up more intensely when there are cravings, or that craving is satisfied, I should say, with a sugary food.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real thing. Like, sugar's a real drug. I mean, I read Gary Taubes' Case Against Sugar, It's just weird that we don't think of it as a drug, but it's highly addictive, and people don't realize that they've been addicted to sugar their whole life, and it's hard to come off sugar. I mean, if you see people trying to give up sugar, it's like giving up heroin or something. They go through withdrawals, and it's serious.
Yeah. I can't really relate that much, but I know because I never felt like I was addicted to sugar as much, or maybe I had cravings, definitely a lot more cravings when I was on a carbohydrate-based diet. And I remember getting shaky and, when my glucose got low. And I don't feel you need to be even on a ketogenic diet to completely eliminate that effect, but just simply going into more of a whole foods-based diet that was shifting to more fat and more fibrous carbohydrates made that difference. We study the ketogenic diet, and that's it's pretty extreme, but it's the problems that we're dealing with now. I wouldn't say like a ketogenic diet is not the solution. It's a major solution. Maybe it's an extreme solution for someone who's severely obese or type 2 diabetic. It might, because they are carbohydrate intolerant to a large extent. And the food addiction may come into play there, but simply reducing, when you drink calories, it has a much different metabolic effect than chewing your food and eating calories. So I think that needs to be appreciated. And I have a much greater appreciation for that since I've been doing very comprehensive measurements of my blood glucose and ketones in response to various foods. For example, when I first got into this, I would mix up a shake of whey protein and fats and things like that were on paper, it was ketogenic. But when I would drink it, it would quickly kick me out of ketosis because liquid foods hit your system like a bolus, whereas foods that you have to eat slower and chew, and when they're in your gut, for them to be released into your small intestine, they essentially have to be liquefied. So this delays gastric absorption in a way that dramatically alters the metabolic profile of the food that you're eating. So we need to consider that liquid nutrition, especially in the form of liquid. A soda is just like liquid candy, really, but it's even more damaging because the liquid calories hit your system like a bolus, and they have a hormonal and neuroendocrine and even a neuropharmacological effect. I would say they really alter the neurotransmitters in your brain when they're consumed.
And even on top of that, you could talk about satiety too. So you're getting all these extra calories, but you're not getting any more full because it's just liquid. So there's so many reasons why you shouldn't be drinking this sugary stuff.
Yeah, you get what we observe, and I've tracked this in myself and seen it in others. You get a postprandial rebound effect from the insulin release where you get hypoglycemic after an hour or 2 or 3 hours. And that there's a postprandial rise in glucose with a release in insulin that brings your glucose levels back down, and you often overshoot kind of because of the massive release of insulin, where you become hypoglycemic. And that hypoglycemia can lead to things like brain fog and things like that. But most importantly, from an eating behavior perspective, is the hypoglycemia triggers the food cravings again. So it becomes like this feed forward process. And I didn't really get an understanding of that until I started sort of obsessive compulsively measuring my glucose in response to things. And I would get hungry, and then I would get a little bit shaky and crave sugar. And, I would measure my glucose and realize that, hey, my glucose was down to 59 or 58. And that's why I have craving. I just wanted to, dig into something. And that's virtually abolished, if not significantly attenuated, with the ketogenic diet, but also just simply a diet that's more like whatever you want to call it, like a low carb paleo diet that just is whole foods and devoid of these processed carbohydrates. It eliminates that response.
Yeah, and I've been trying to figure out what to call this, like a sapient diet. I don't want to be connected with the paleo or keto, but this is just what humans are meant to eat. You don't have to go ketogenic and go crazy. You don't need to obsessively count carbs and get ketone measuring strips. Just a sapient diet to me is whole foods, no grains, no sugar. And yes, in the lower carb spectrum, just, highly nutrient dense foods like meats and fish and green vegetables and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, and that well, it brings in a whole nother thing. Like, do we need to eat meat, or should we have meat every meal? And can you have a well balanced, vegan diet and things like that? So that brings up a lot of other questions. I'm not sure your film is, but I think if we just look at our history, I don't think there's a whole lot of thriving populations that are vegan. Or if we look at the blue zones, for example, people who just have exceptional longevity and robust health. I should probably research this more, but I don't think any of those blue zones are vegans. They usually
No, they're not. No,
very
they aren't. Yeah, some of them eat less meat than others. But yeah, I've been looking into this a bit, and there are no multi-generational cultures that have been vegan. I'm actually really interested in Weston A. Price stuff now. I'm almost done with the book. It's sort of a slog. It's like this thick book about, but quickly, it's about what we were talking about earlier, kind of is when westernized diets are introduced into cultures. He was a dentist in the 1920s and 30s, saw so much tooth decay and was like, this is not normal. This doesn't make any evolutionary sense. I'm going to go figure this out. Went all over the world, and he found that the people living in their native way had amazing health and amazing teeth, and it was connected. And he looked at all the commonalities, what they did have and what they didn't have. And I love this part because what they didn't have is refined flours and sugars and vegetable oils. And what they all did have was these highly nutrient dense animal proteins and fats like organ meats, oily fish, milk from cows on fastly growing grass, insects protein, even just all this stuff. And they even had special rituals. All these cultures, he went from the top of the Alps to Melanesia and found the same patterns that they would even have. Say 6 months before a woman would be married or get pregnant, she would eat a special diet. And it always included these nutrient-dense animal foods like seafood and fish eggs or organ meats. It's really amazing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those foods we've shied away in the United States, at least. Many of us have shied away from things like organ meats and some of the foods that you mentioned. My wife is European; she's from Hungary, and when we got together, it was very common for her to eat organ meats on a regular basis. So that's something that I include that I didn't previously, but it has made my nutrition much more interesting. And much more enjoyable and tasty too, because these things taste fantastic, and I avoided them just because they just weren't part of my regular meal plans.
Yeah, we don't think about them. But yeah, chicken liver is pretty good. I'm learning. So I just started this recently, and I went to the farmer's market, and it's pretty good. I'm learning to like it and how to cook it. A lot of onions and garlic, and
exactly what I was thinking of. My wife cooks that, and we get beef liver, and she cooks it, with onions and spices and in butter and everything like that. And that's one of our favorite dishes that we had. And growing up, I mean, you would never. My mom just never cooked liver, it's like, then use it kind of in a derogatory term, like, who am I, chop liver? Like it was something that was dog.
Yeah, like liver and onions was like the worst meal. That's like example of like a horrible thing.
And I think it's actually one of my favorite now. My wife introduced me to that and many other things, and all these new things that she introduced me to over the years. They're kind of all my favorite foods now. So
yeah, I feel so full and satisfied after. I think there's something really to it. Your body's getting everything it needs and you're just satisfied.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And this actually goes into kind of a lot of things we touched on that what I saw in Japan. I was in Japan recently and they eat a lot of this stuff. All this, we got chicken liver and all these weird seafoods, and it also connects to the rice we were talking about. So they didn't eat that much rice and noodles. It was more of like a cheap filler for like cheap meals. Inexpensive meals had all the rice and noodles, but we were kind of eating nicer. We were vacationing. There was full restaurants where we didn't see any rice or noodles. It was just all meat and seafood and vegetables. Yeah. And I think people are wondering why they're so healthy. There's blue zones. Like you're talking about, Okinawa is a blue zone. A lot of Japanese live long lives. And people are like, oh yeah, well they eat tons of rice. Like you're an idiot. Like your low carb thing is stupid. And another thing we talked about is it's a little bland, or you're just not combining the sugar. Yeah. So if you're just eating rice, you're not going to overeat. It's not an engineered taste. It's not a Dorito. Eating rice and fish, you're not going to sit there and eat 5,000 calorie meal off of that. You're going to eat what you want and then you're done. It's not processed. It's not scientifically engineered by food scientists to make you eat forever. And there's also not a lot of sugar.
Yeah.
Even their desserts are pretty mellow, right? They're just sort of like green tea ice cream could be not that sweet.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising they're healthy if you're eating just rice and fish and meat and vegetables, and they're eating all the bits and pieces, chicken liver and tons of stuff, way more stuff than we would eat. Of course they're healthy. They're eating the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. And yes, they're having some rice. Also, they're tolerant to that. They have carb tolerance that allows them to do this. It is genetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And there's a culture too. Like you just, you eat a certain amount, but you don't overeat. And you're much less likely to overeat rice than you would like a bag of chips. That's just obvious, really.
Hari Hachibu.
Yeah.
Is that what? Have you heard of that term?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I love that. It was like the one English term or one Japanese term we could use, and everyone's like, "Oh, Hari Hachibu." They thought we were so interesting because it means eat until you're 80% full, basically, and that's a good practice that we don't have in America. And I'll admit, I don't have. I definitely can binge eat. But I mean, when I ate the right foods and these more nutrient dense, low carb foods, maybe only twice a day, it's fine. You can stuff your face and be fine and just do that 16-hour fast maybe. I wanted to mention too, some people think fasting, it's like, oh, you're just starving yourself, or you're like a waif model. This is so stupid. We're talking about eating the same amount of calories. If you're intermittent fasting, say you eat 3,000 calories a day, you're just eating those 3,000 calories in a smaller window. It's not like you're starving yourself.
Yeah, exactly. So you're not, it can be a method of dietary energy restriction, because if you tell people to eat within, if you tell people to do time restricted eating and say, just eat within this 8-hour window, and you look at all their calories, they tend to restrict a little bit. And I think that can be helpful. But if you start pushing it to eat all your calories within a 4-hour window, then it becomes kind of hard, harder for them, and there's less compliance. But most people, I think the simplest thing to do is just eat all your calories within a 12-hour window, like something that simple. You eat dinner at 7 and maybe have a little dessert after, and then you don't eat again. 7 p.m. you do eat dinner, and then you don't eat again till 7 or 8 p.m. in the morning, and that's 12 hours. So basically just not eat. Yeah. So something that simple. For me, I kind of like to eat at night. So I will kind of snack and eat until 10 or 10:30. I have like this ketogenic ice cream that I have. And then I will this morning skip breakfast because I had an early meeting with the lab. And then I'll eat, around noon. So maybe I'll go like 14 hours without eating. I don't do it every morning, but I do it probably every other day.
Yeah, it's easy when you're fat adapted and
save time too.
Yeah, I love it. I was initially opposed to it. I was like, I don't need to do this. But if you just try it, it's easy. I feel great. Why don't we move on to some more stuff you're talking about with ketones and your brain, and cancer as a metabolic disease is something that I'm really interested in, that I know you've worked on a lot. And there's guys like Dr. Thomas Seyfried that you've collaborated with. Yeah. And I mean, it goes back to Otto Warburg, I guess, in 1920. So I guess why don't you kind of introduce this stuff to us?
Yeah, sure. Well, and, Otto Warburg was a scientist who studied metabolism starting in the early 1920s through the mid and late 1920s and decades after even, and made the observation that cancer cells relied on glucose as an energy source. And they're generating energy through a process called fermentation. Right? They were literally fermenting glucose to make energy. It's an inefficient, sort of archaic process, like the very early life forms that formed on Earth in the absence or deficiency of oxygen used fermentation to generate our energy currency in the form of ATP. So his theory, or what the Warburg effect essentially was, damaged oxidative phosphorylation or respiration. Cells use oxygen to make ATP through the mitochondria, and that's a process called respiration. So damaged respiration with compensatory fermentation. So because the mitochondria of the cancer cells are damaged, there is a default, genes are kicked on, and many different things can transition a normal cell to a cancer cell. It's kind of like the oncogenic paradox, and it's kind of an interrelated kind of observation that the normal cell's transition to a cancer cell is basically a dysregulation of metabolism from a mitochondrial deriving ATP bioenergetic pathway to a glycolysis generating ATP bioenergetic pathway. And there are many benefits to the cancer cell in that when in a low oxygen environment, as a tumor grows, the oxygen supply is limited. So it endows those cancer cells with the ability to grow in an oxygen limited environment. And it also causes the cancer cells to pump out something called lactate. And the lactate acidifies the microenvironment of the tumor, the expanding biomass of the tumor, and can allow some of those cells to invade and metastasize into the blood to other organs. So the Warburg effect is really a description that we use that describes the aberrant metabolism of cancer. And oncologists use a tool called a positron emission tomography, a PET scan, that's imaging a glucose molecule that's radio labeled. And that's kind of like the gold standard to identify the location and also the aggressiveness of that cancer. So the more intense the uptake of this glucose molecule, radio-labeled glucose molecule, on the PET scan, the more indication that that's an aggressive tumor. So oncologists use that tool to identify the location and aggressiveness, but they don't use that information to actually target the tumor. They traditionally use things like chemotherapeutic drugs or radiation. Over the last, I would say 8 years, because 10 years ago, I don't think I remember cancer conferences where the whole theme was targeting tumor metabolism. This has exploded, almost like people are jumping on the bandwagon and looking at not only drugs that target the Warburg effect, but also diets that target and nutrition, and the ketogenic diet being sort of the top of the list there. And that is where we kind of come in. We made some early observations that the ketogenic diet could reduce the spread and proliferation of cancer in aggressive metastatic models. And my colleague at Boston College was one of the first people to observe this in a variety of brain tumor models. So you prolong the life of the animal and limited the growth of the tumor if they were on a ketogenic diet. And in particular, if the ketogenic diet was calorie restricted, you even got a further extension of life. We chose to do a ketogenic diet that was not restricted because we wanted to determine if it was sort of just a state of being in nutritional ketosis. And my graduate student, now research associate at the time, used the ketogenic diet in a metastatic model of cancer. And we saw extension of life in a ketogenic diet that was not calorie restricted. And now we know that the ketogenic diet, nutritional ketosis, I would say, because it can be achieved in different ways, targets all the hallmarks of cancer. So that includes it reduces proliferation, it reduces angiogenesis, it enhances tumor-associated immunity, it helps the immune system recognize the cancer and kill it. It reduces invasion and metastasis, and it also targets the inflammation and the aberrant, most importantly, probably the aberrant metabolic pathways associated with the rapid rate of proliferation and growth of tumors. So it directly limits glucose availability to the tumor, and it also reduces insulin, the hormone insulin, and insulin signaling. And we know various growth factors are influenced by the hormone insulin, and the ketogenic diet actually makes ketones by suppressing the hormone insulin. So you are suppressing probably the major growth hormone pathway that cancer cells use, and that suppression of that growth hormone pathway actually gets the body to produce ketones. And then the ketones, on top of that, we think have an anti-cancer effect. For some cancers, maybe not all cancers, but most cancers really cannot use ketones as an energy source very efficiently for fuel. So we're looking into what cancers may be most responsive to nutritional ketosis.
Yeah, that's cool. So you used a lot of big words there and a lot of science going on. But the overview is that you put a tracker on glucose and you can see that these cancer cells use a lot of glucose. And cancer feeds off of glucose and, like you said, fermentation. But there's a different way that our bodies can run. Our cells, our mitochondria can use ketones. And so by eating a ketogenic diet, then you can starve the cancer cells of glucose and they can't run on these ketones, but your brain and your other cells can run on ketones. Is that kind of it?
Yeah, and it's not completely switching over to ketones instead of glucose, right? What you are doing is you're reducing those glucose spikes, and those spikes in glucose really, in a pulse fashion, they feed the cancer cells. A nutritional ketosis takes the brake off the gas. It takes the foot off the gas pedal of cancer growth. That's what I like to say, because if a cancer patient is told to eat as much sugary foods and carbohydrates as much as possible to keep their weight up during chemo, to prevent the wasting effect that cancer has, that can have a profoundly negative effect. And now we're just realizing it, and more progressive oncology centers they're realizing that that's not a very great approach for the outcome of their patients, which will really affect their bottom line, right? Which is generating income through radiation therapy and chemo, and the outcome of their patients is really their bottom line. So now they're more interested in becoming increasingly interested in nutritional approaches that will not be used as a standalone, but they are looking at nutritional ketosis as a means to further augment the therapeutic effects of the treatments they have to offer. And there is a shift towards more non-toxic treatments like immune-based therapies. And that's exciting to see that. But we also think there's a lot of potential in simply targeting the very things that the ketogenic diet targets, which is glucose metabolism, perhaps glutamine metabolism, which is an amino acid, the hormone insulin, and also just changing the fuel systems that the body runs on can have a profound effect. So the way I view it is, if you change your metabolic physiology, so just completely change the fuel system that your body is running on, that actually targets all the hallmarks of cancer. So there's a seminal paper that everybody refers to, and it was written by Weinberg and the people who wrote the book. I mean, I guess you could say really wrote the book on on cancer biology. And this book really talks about the hallmarks of cancer, and many of the drugs that are on the market, they target a particular hallmark of cancer. For example, Avastin targets angiogenesis, and another drug may reduce cancer cell proliferation, but does not target angiogenesis. Well, the ketogenic diet sort of changes your entire metabolic physiology to hit everything. So if you think of your body as like a fertile ground for cancer to grow on, right? So the little, nobody dies of a tumor, but if typically, unless it's a brain tumor, but they die of the tumor metastasizing to different areas of the body where it seeds, right? A ketogenic diet is basically like taking the fertilizer off of that fertile land and preventing those cancer cells to seed and take hold and start proliferating in your liver, or in your lung or in your brain. And it's preventing that. And periodically fasting puts tremendous metabolic stress on precancerous cells and even existing cancer cells, and may help to purge cancer from the body. And I think that could be an effective strategy for someone maybe who has had cancer and is in remission. They could, every couple months, they could do a 3 or 4, maybe a 7-day fast, and do it in a healthy manner, maybe under even medical supervision, and kind of purge their body of potentially precancerous cells or cells that can be. Now, this is a theory. It's very controversial, what I just said. But I think the major cancer biologists now, especially the ones that target metabolism, guys like Luke Cantley, maybe even guys like Craig Thompson, like the people in the National Cancer Institute, may agree with this, that you can change your global metabolic physiology in a way that would make cancer less likely to proliferate in the body by knocking down inflammation. Inflammation's a hallmark of cancer, by reducing glucose, by reducing insulin. And we know many different cancers that are now more prevalent, including liver cancer, gallbladder cancer, pancreatic cancer, endometrial cancer. These things are much more prevalent in people with type 2 diabetes and obesity. So by virtue of correcting our nutrition and correcting our metabolism, we could stave off, some of these more metabolically driven cancers from even happening.
Well, these isn't normal. None of these native populations or all our ancestors didn't get all these cancers, really. It goes along with our modern diet and modern chronic disease. So it makes a lot of sense that it's based on what we're eating, and it is a metabolic disease. To go back a little bit, for the past, I don't know how many years, people have been thinking of cancer like only as a genetic thing, it seems like. And now it's being more accepted that there's a big metabolic component. But of course, it is genetic, but the metabolic component can turn it on.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are many different things that could cause cancer, and this is the oncogenic paradox. It's been described over the years. Radiation, carcinogens, inflammation, viruses that cause cancer tend to target the mitochondria even. And the things that I just mentioned and many other things, they have a common trait in that they damage the cell's DNA, and they damage the mitochondria. And the mitochondria have their own DNA. What's interesting, the mitochondrial DNA do not have the robust DNA repair mechanisms that the nucleus has, right? And there's this crosstalk. The mitochondria are the little powerhouses in the cell. Right? Or we have billions of these cells in different tissues, the brain, liver, kidneys, other organs. And when you progressively damage the cell with various provocative agents like drugs, immune factors and things like that, creating inflammation, you are damaging the mitochondria and the mitochondrial DNA more than the nuclear DNA. And that can create an energetic crisis. So the cell's ATP levels fall in response to some of these toxic agents in the body, and even hypoxia, right? So just, having a state of hypoxia, if your blood doesn't flow, well to your liver because of you're drinking lots of alcohol or taking some kind of, you have inflammation from, some kind of factor, environmental factor, that can transition a normal healthy cell to a cancer cell. The cell senses an energetic crisis if it can't effectively make ATP. So ATP levels, the energy in the level cell fall, and the nucleus is like the brain of the cell. And then it can sense through this retrograde effect, it can sense that the cell is having an energetic crisis, right? And to combat the cell's energetic crisis, it kicks on various genes. These genes are called oncogenes. And many of the oncogenes endow the cell with proliferative capacity and can transition that cell to a cell that ferments glucose instead of makes energy through respiration, through mitochondrial effects. So the mitochondria are really the powerhouse of the cell, and the ability of the mitochondria to make energy is what keeps the cell healthy and happy and prevents the cell from becoming a cancer cell. If you have very robust, healthy mitochondria, that is the ultimate tumor suppressor. So I think basically that's what I want to say, but it works. So if your mitochondria are robustly healthy and they're making lots of ATP and they're not making lots of oxygen-free radicals, which happens when you damage the mitochondria, we call them free radicals. If you have very robust mitochondria, that means you have very good metabolic health. And metabolic health is the ultimate prevention against cancer. And when your body is burning fat and ketones in a very efficient manner, and your glucose is low and your insulin stays low, you have high insulin sensitivity, that's an indication that you're metabolically healthy and you are much less likely to get cancer, especially the types of cancers that are really metabolically linked cancer, which are many of them, from liver to gallbladder to endometrial, pancreatic. Many of these things are driven by metabolic factors. So that's like the take home message. I think people need to really appreciate that this is not just about looking good. It's not about, losing weight. The implications are much, much greater. It's about extending your life another 10 years because you've transitioned your body to a different fuel source that's keeping your mitochondria healthy and suppressing the expression of oncogenes that we may have a genetic predisposition for. So there are genetic factors in cancer for sure. What I just described to you was metabolic initiation of a genetic cancer. So when someone says it's completely a metabolic disease or a completely genetic disease, what the field believes is that particular genes are not necessarily regulated by metabolism. And what the emerging idea is that metabolic control, the health of our mitochondria, really dictate the expression of these cancer genes. So the take-home message would be, as I mentioned before, do a variety of things to keep your mitochondria as healthy as possible. So that could be nutrition, low stress, exercise, perhaps breathing exercises, perhaps, some supplements. Periodic intermittent fasting may be helpful. A lot of what I'm saying is speculative, but some things are definitely not speculative. Some things are, if you keep your hemoglobin H1C in a low to healthy range and you keep your insulin in a low to healthy range, they are probably the most important biomarkers for people to track. So when people say, okay, well, that makes great sense. You talked a lot of science, but what can I do? What they can do is actually measure your glucose levels and glucose response to a meal, and your fasting glucose should be, within a healthy range. And that's a pretty good indication of your metabolic health.
Yeah, definitely. And it all makes common sense. And a sapien diet, we'll call it, we'll do all this, right? It'll keep your blood glucose low, keep your insulin in check, keep your inflammation down. We're not promising you're not going to get cancer, but if you do all these things, which makes sense in an evolutionary context, our ancestors probably didn't have all these problems of inflammation and high insulin. If you're eating real foods, you're not eating a ton of sugar, you won't express these genes. You have your best chance. Even if you're genetically marked for, say, certain cancers, you can not express them by keeping your body healthy. And that's pretty obvious, and you can't really attack that. So
and that's I think that's a good summary of it. I mean, we are activating genes that would otherwise be silenced in other populations who have not adopted our eating or lifestyle factors. I think you could safely say that.
Yeah, that's not that controversial to say at all. And so this is also the same goes for Alzheimer's. I did a whole podcast with Amy Berger about this, and it's pretty similar what you've been talking about with cancer, right? It's the same thing. Is you can have these genes but not express them. It's about not having the high insulin. There's a lot of commonalities there, right?
Yeah, and metabolism really does. Some of the new advances in metabolism have really pointed to various metabolites as altering gene expression. And beta hydroxybutyrate is one of the ketone levels, one of the ketone metabolites that we can measure with like a commercially available meter that you can buy at any Walgreens or CVS. And it functions as something called not to use big words again, as a histone deacetylase inhibitor. So that's an HDAC inhibitor. And HDAC inhibitors are a really intense investigation in a number of pharmaceutical companies that have actually been talking with me because they are very interested in beta hydroxybutyrate functioning as an endogenous metabolite, something that our body makes can actually have fairly profound epigenetic effects. They can turn on various gene pathways and maybe silence other gene pathways. And one particular disease that we have recently become interested in studying is something called Kabuki Syndrome. And I believe Kabuki was a theater in Japan.
Yeah.
Have you been there maybe? I know you've been to Japan.
No, I just learned about it. I grew up in Hawaii and we learned about Japanese culture. And I remember they're like little plays. Kabuki is like a theater. Yeah.
Yes.
Plays they put on. Yeah.
Well, that was just actually told to me by two parents who are medical doctors, and they are members of an organization, a foundation, that is helping form a community for parents and kids that have Kabuki Syndrome, which is a rare genetic disease. And I won't go into, I'm myself kind of working on understanding sort of the genetics behind it. But what I think is remarkable is that the ketogenic diet, by virtue of the metabolite, beta hydroxybutyrate, functioning as an HDAC inhibitor, having this effect on DNA and gene expression that we only thought drugs could have an effect on, that this special diet could essentially open up DNA and turn on genes that could improve learning and memory and suppress some of the symptoms associated with Kabuki Syndrome. And that's a whole new area of investigation that's being intensely studied by scientists, the ability of a metabolic therapy in the form of a diet regulating our DNA to, in this case, you're using it essentially to treat a very rare genetic disorder that has a lot of neurological consequences in regards to learning and memory and on that front. But the general community is also very interested in these ketones functioning as genetic regulators in the context of longevity, in the context of preventing many of these diseases. And maybe if we were to start a ketogenic diet therapy early in a parent that knew their child was going to have Kabuki syndrome, if they could be tested early, right now that's not being done, that may help to potentially silence some of the genes or some of the aberrant DNA expression that could otherwise be happening. So it's a very interesting front. So you're going to see more research now on things like Kabuki syndrome, where we're using maybe not the ketogenic diet, but we're taking supplements of metabolites that the body already makes. And our lab really works. A lot of what we do is actually looking at ketone supplements in the form of an ester or the form of a ketone electrolyte preparation that can be consumed. And it kind of mimics in many ways the state of therapeutic fasting or therapeutic ketogenic diet by elevating these metabolites, these bioidentical metabolites that the body makes.
Yeah, that's really cool. I've been following along with that. And I know we don't have too much time, but also it really relates to the epilepsy. And I know you talked about the Charlie Foundation and the magic pill on Netflix. That's so big right now. I see it's trending every time I go on Netflix, which is awesome that people are learning about this. Yeah, maybe you could just talk about that for like 2 minutes, just about epilepsy.
Yeah, sure. So when I started studying the ketogenic diet for seizures, I stumbled upon the Charlie Foundation first came up in a Google search. I don't know where it's at now, but it was like the go-to to learn about the ketogenic diet. And I was really blown away that there was a whole community. And looking back, I think I used to watch a show, Dateline NBC, and I remember actually seeing the story, but I wasn't interested in the ketogenic diet or seizures at the time, with Jim Abrams and his son, Charlie, who was essentially cured of epilepsy. So cured defined as he followed the diet, weaned himself off of it, and then the epilepsy never came back. No drugs really do that. If you abruptly stop, usually you have a rebound effect. So the ketogenic diet has a very stabilizing effect on brain energy metabolism, but also the neuropharmacology of the brain, and balances the neurotransmitters of the brain in a way that prevents seizures. And we don't know exactly how it works. So that's actually what we study in the lab, and we're still a little, not necessarily confused. We just know that it's many different things synergistically working together, unlike a drug, which is targeting a specific pathway. And that's the beauty of the ketogenic diet, that it works like that. So the Charlie Foundation used to be the Charlie Foundation for pediatric epilepsy, but because the ketogenic diet is now being used for so many different applications, the foundation is the Charlie Foundation for ketogenic therapies. And now there's many on their website. Not only do they have recipes and a store and resources and little videos that explain the ketogenic diet, which would be great for your listeners, it talks about what I think is super exciting, all the emerging applications of the ketogenic diet. And I've helped them with some of the educational content, kind of breaks it down. And there's also support on there. So if someone, this sounds great, the recipes sound great and everything, but I need professional support, there's links on there that will connect you to a registered dietitian based upon your geographical location. And then you can connect with them and get help, or get help for your child who may have epilepsy or another disorder that is beneficial, with the ketogenic diet. So that's a go-to resource that I always give people, the Charlie Foundation.
Yeah, it's so great. And it's crazy that 2/3 of kids find benefit with diet alone.
Yeah, well, and that's in kids that have failed one or multiple anti-epileptic drugs. Only then do they use the ketogenic diet. So it's a grossly underutilized metabolic therapy for kids, right? And then for the pediatric population, those kids, if they're given various anti-epileptic drugs, that can cause severe developmental consequences. So I really believe that the first line of therapy, especially for the developing brain, should not be a potent anticonvulsant drug. It should be the ketogenic diet, because I think it's much more safe. When it's
first, no harm.
Yeah, first do no harm. And I think it needs to be done with medical supervision, of course. But that should be the first line before loading kids up with multiple anti-epileptic drugs. So about 2/3 of kids who completely fail drug therapy respond favorably to the ketogenic diet. And there's a subpopulation of those that are super responders. So they have permanent seizure control and they can come off and then be essentially cured, ultimately be cured of their epilepsy. So if there was a drug that, if like all the drugs failed and hey, there was this wonder drug that worked for, 2/3 of the cases when all the drugs failed, that would be a mega blockbuster drug to the epilepsy world. The issue is that the ketogenic diet, implementing it, is a science and an art. And we're holding a conference called the Metabolic Health Summit that's going to be in LA, January 31st to February 3rd in 2019. And our conference will talk about the science and talk about the clinical implementation of the ketogenic diet. But most importantly, we're going to bring many of the registered dietitians and many of the nutrition folks who are practicing not only the science of the ketogenic diet, but the art of preparing ketogenic food, whether that be a chicken or fish dish or cupcakes or crepes or pancakes or cookies. Food technology is evolving, or food engineering is evolving to where we can make whole food-based ingredients and actually have the macronutrient profile of the ketogenic diet. And it's going to be where science meets human application. And we're going to have, major influencers there. And we're also going to have a very big footprint of entrepreneurs who are just getting into this space. And there are many entrepreneurs scrambling to get into the low carb ketogenic diet space because it is becoming more of a lifestyle, not just for the clinical things that I'm talking about, but people are using it periodically, or maybe like me, I'm using it all the time, just in my daily life as a means to just enhance my health and vitality.
Absolutely. I'm 100% going to be there. I can't wait. Sounds so cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And we appreciate you allowing me to talk about this and being a platform and sharing the conference with others. I can give you the link to the Metabolic Health Summit, where we want it to be a synergy of all the people who are interested in this. And it doesn't have to be, you might be able to get medical education credits for it, but it's not all about the doctors. There's going to be something for everybody at this conference, whether you're an athlete, whether you are very new to the ketogenic diet, or whether you're an oncologist or even an epileptologist, who's studying the ketogenic diet for epilepsy. There's going to be information for everybody.
Awesome. And I just had an idea to go out on relating to the Charlie Foundation. And Jim Abrams is an old Hollywood producer, made big movies like Airplane and stuff.
Absolutely.
And what's so crazy about this is what we need to change is the whole medical system, the way we do things in America. He went to the hospital. No drugs worked for his son, Charlie. He went to the library and started flipping through a book and found that 100 years ago, they would use the ketogenic diet as the main therapy before they developed these drugs for seizures. They used the diet. And he was like, hey, doctors, why don't we try this? This seems a lot safer and it seems pretty effective. And they're like, oh, yeah, maybe.
Yeah. That's a huge problem. And he was so angry that this therapeutic modality was not offered to him. And that was the motivation. Obviously, his son was stricken with very severe epilepsy, but he responded remarkably well, like many people do who start the ketogenic diet, pediatric population and adults, and just realized that it was necessary to advocate for the ketogenic diet and that it was a grossly underutilized approach for epilepsy that could undo a lot of harm that the anti-epileptic drugs were doing. And he had friends like Meryl Streep who did a movie about the ketogenic diet. And sometimes, when I give talks, people are kind of shocked to hear that Meryl Streep did a movie about the keto diet, the ketogenic diet. But it was one of the things that I watched very early on, and I was like kind of blown away by it. And I was like, okay, there's not only science behind it, there's really legit and compelling stories behind it. There's people, there's personalities. So it became such an engaging area of research for me to, and my undergraduate degree was in nutrition too. So bring that back into a neuroscience research program was really thrilling to me. And connecting with Jim Abrams was like the pinnacle of the thrill. I first met him in 2010, I believe, in Edinburgh in Scotland. And I was telling him, about the ketone esters and things like that and the ketogenic diet and how it inspired me so much. And, so it's just been kind of like one thing after another, very inspirational stories. The science is emerging. You look on PubMed and there's an explosion of research behind the ketogenic diet. I just feel very lucky and fortunate to have gone on this path when some people were discouraging, some people were saying it's academic suicide to be in a pharmacology department or physiology department and to start studying this weird high-fat diet. As a junior professor going into a tenure track position, that it was sort of like academic suicide, but it all worked out because I realized that something that works, something that's providing benefit and value to other people is going to come back to you in some way, shape, or form. And I just really believed in my heart that nutrition was medicine.
Yeah, that's so awesome that you stuck to it. And I believe, I'm in. I want to.
Yeah, I know you are.
I want to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out ways to implement this, spread the word, anything I can do. And that's why I'm making Food Lies and having this podcast and having guys like you inspire me and everyone else listening. And actually, we're on Indiegogo right now for the film. We need to crowdfund to get this film going. We filmed about half of it, but we need help because I've kind of been almost self-funding a lot of this and just calling in favors and trying to get this thing made. So we really need the support of people to finish it off. And we'll be filming with you in Ohio. There's a big conference on carb restriction and ketogenic science and all that. So I'm really looking forward to that. We got Professor Noakes and Gary Taubes and Nina Teichels, and it's going to be awesome. We're going to try to shoot something together with all of you at once.
That's great. I can't wait for that conference. I know Jeff Volk has done a lot of work putting this together, and it's going to be a great synergy of minds there for you to extract and tap. And I think it's going to be very valuable information for you and your listeners or your watchers for the movie.
Definitely. So I guess that's a great way to go out. Thank you so much. I know you have some more meetings to go to and doing all the Lord's work.
Yeah, less fun stuff, but I appreciate you giving me this platform. As I mentioned, it's really what you are doing is probably more important. You are the key. You are linking the science to the people, and this needs to. Otherwise, us scientists would just kind of stay locked in our labs doing our thing. But unless you're on PubMed, you're not going to know about some of the nutrition information that's science being done. So. Thank you very much for allowing me to talk about this.
Sure. And let's thank the listeners in advance for just sharing this with more people. That's all I care about is sharing with your friends and family, share this podcast and eventually the movie. Yeah, I will. And when it comes out, I'll share it I'll blast it out through my network and everyone,
everybody will be thrilled to watch your movie and share the important message that you are providing. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I'll see you soon.
Yeah. See you soon, Brian. Thank you.
And that's a wrap. Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks in advance for sharing and subscribing and writing a review on iTunes and talking to your neighbor and giving this podcast to your mom or your cousin and checking out the Indiegogo. We'll see you next week. Thank you.